So we've discussed the host and recipient access tables. That allows traffic to actually make it into the ESA. Are we even going to accept your message to begin with? So let's say that we decided to accept it. Now what? Well, this is where the ESA really does some interesting work, and this is where it's going to enforce all of its policies regarding what the contents of the message can actually do. We weren't looking for malware. We weren't really analyzing it to determine whether it was spyware or a virus or gray mail or a phishing campaign. We didn't even look at anything yet. We just looked at the connectivity itself. That's why I said the connectivity is really regulated in three major areas: traffic coming into, traffic being processed by, and then traffic being sent out of. What we see here with the mail policies is what's happening when the email is actually being processed by the ESA. And one of the important things to understand is that we can create these mail policies. Of course, we can modify that default one, and we can say, okay, this is how all company through or all email through the entire company should be processed. And then you could look at that and say, well, IT, they've got requirements. Sales, they've got different requirements. Legal has different requirements. How about your security team? What type of filtering should we do on their email? And you go, well, none, because they're receiving phishing attempts. If somebody thinks they're being phished, if somebody has a malicious thing, they're supposed to send it to the security department. So you may have divisions within your company that are highly targeted, right? Finance, HR, maybe your executives. And you say, we want to throw everything we can to screen this traffic as hard as we can. And you go, what about the security operations team? And you go, oh, the complete opposite. We want everything malicious and miserable to go in there because they're actually responsible for the analysis. And again, maybe that isn't appropriate for your company. Realize that this can happen on a global level. It can happen on a group level. We can do it on a per recipient or per sender level. So what we'll do is we'll say, hey, sensor, when you see IT users, when you see sales users, when you see legal users, a lot of times we'll tie into authentication credentials to figure out who they are. And then once we know who they are in the group membership, we can determine what it is that they're allowed to do. So in this example, the IT group is allowed media files, and we would quarantine executables. If something's nasty, it's executable, we quarantine it. They can still come get it, but it's not like the sales team, where we mark and deliver spam and delete executables. Or legal, where we archive all email, and we don't have any outbreak filters for doc files. Why? Maybe that gave us issues previously. So again, just know that there's not a perfect fit for every customer or every particular user group. We've got policies to deal with individual groups as well as individual users. So remember that when we create these policies, they're basically going to be applied to incoming and outgoing email. So what do we do on the way in? What do we do on the way out? And then when we're looking at that pipeline in either direction, we can apply these features: anti-spam, antivirus, AMP, gray mail, content filters, outbreak filters, and DLP. The mail policies can be managed from the GUI or from the CLI. You're like, wait a minute, ESA's got a CLI? It does, but you typically don't go there on a good day. If things are corrupted, if an upgrade went bad, those are typically my CLI time in the ESA hasn't been like the finest hours. Under normal circumstances, you're going to do the majority of your work through the GUI. Just realize that there is a CLI that you can get into. Maybe there's a command or there's a capability that you just can't find from the GUI, especially from like an administrative, like running the box perspective. Know that you can also SSH in if you need to. New policies inherit settings from the default policy by default, meaning when you create your global policy, do this in such a way that it matches the entire company. And then what we'll do is we'll create a new group. The group is going to inherit everything that we set before. So all we've got to do is change the exceptions. This makes multiple groups easier to manage. Remember that your policies are evaluated in a top-down fashion, and the first match is going to stick. And the security features from the email pipeline are available for each policy, and they make this easy. The direction of the features processing is from left to right. That is to say, we do anti-spam before we do antivirus, before we do AMP, before we do gray mail, before we do content, before we do outbreak. So the email gets processed like this. It's kind of neat. Pretty smart that they designed it that way. So when we match users to a mail policy, how would you do that? And you go, well, let's just look at the envelope. If I wanted to match an IP address to an access control list, source and destination IP, when I'm thinking about users to a mail policy, if I'm using a recipient access table, well, who's the recipient? If I'm thinking about the sender, who's the sender? I can create different rules based on who's sending me messages. Remember that you're going to have at least a sender and a recipient within a mail policy. It's got to apply to somebody. You can set the policy to match if. Again, just think of it as a big if condition. The message is from any sender, one or more of the specified senders, or none of the senders. So it's almost like if it's everybody or nobody. We can be very broad or we can be very exclusive. The senders and recipients to whom the policy applies can also be defined in a number of ways. Either full email address or even partial, like you see there. All users in a domain, or all users in a partial domain. We could hit subdomains if we wanted to. And then additionally, as mentioned before, we can tie this into LDAP queries as well. So the top-down order becomes important when you have multiple policies. The first match that you hit is what you're going to take. So a single policy should group as many users as possible. Traffic comes in, we've got maybe a policy for sam@example.com, and then we've got a policy for example.com. Because sam@example.com is more specific, I would have it ranked higher, right? So that it hits that first. If they were ranked differently, sam@example.com does match at example.com, and Sam would be applied the general policy, not his specific policy, if he were out of order. Pretty easy, right? Julie at securex.public sends a zip file to sam@example.com. Sam does not get the message due to the drop zip content filter. And you're like, what's a drop zip content filter? Content filters can filter the content of emails. Someone created a rule set called drop zip that's going to drop zip files. That's a content filter, just the fact that we can drop it. What's neat is that it's been applied to a specific policy called development. And then what happens is with that development policy, we're saying the user would be anybody at example.com. So again, when sam@example.com receives that email, the zip is going to be dropped. Julie at SecureX Public sends a zip file to sam@example.com. Sam gets the message because SecureX.public sender policy acts first. What are they talking about there? Well, notice in this top policy set, we had none here. But also notice the priority, 1, 2. What they did here was move from SecureX to 1. So we hit that policy first, which hits this content filter. Again, this would be appropriate. Yes, Sam is sam@example.com, but this is more specific. So we go, if the sender is that particular user, do this. Now you can do whatever's most appropriate for your circumstances. Just realize that when you hit inevitable scenarios where there's somebody trying to pass something and we false positived and we grabbed it or stopped it, what do? Sometimes maybe what they're trying to do just shouldn't, we have to push back and we go, really? This isn't the company policy? You can't do that stuff. It's dangerous. Alternatively, maybe we make an exceptional rule for that particular user, or maybe for that particular file type, and realize that we can even create this between domains. This is pretty nifty, message splintering. So message splintering allows differing recipient-based content security rules. Just chew on that for a second. We were just looking at these, recipient-based, sam@example.com. So we can allow different recipient-based content security rules to be applied independently to a message with multiple recipients. So we go, and again, you can imagine, you go, well, wait, we can match on from and to. What happens when it's to multiple people? And, well, we can be granular. We can have the most specific policy match. Again, this requires additional checking. It's going to be some overhead, but it's not outside the realm of things that we can do. So handling messages with multiple senders. Looking at message actions, what do we do when we see the message? We go, okay, it was that user talking to that user, what next? And I go, oh, we'll do some anti-spam, do some antivirus, skip the gray mail because it wouldn't be relevant, etc.